Welcome back, everyone, to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization Show, the home of Googlization Nation, where we talk with HR and business thought leaders about the crazy shift going on all around us and explore the disruptive convergence of technology, business, and people. Here are your hosts, Ira Wolfe and Jason Kotler.
Happy holidays and Happy New Year, everyone. I'm Ira Wolfe, and welcome to our last Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization episode of the year. Thank you for being part of Googlization Nation. And what a year it's been. Not only is Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization the recipient of the Most Forward-Thinking Impact Award from the People Forward Network, but we get to close out the year with the incomparable Steven Kotler.
That's right, Ira. And I'm Jason Cochran. If you think this is just another podcast, think again. We're the voice of the most important, crucial conversations that are confronting business leaders and people today. Our goal is to bring you ways to reimagine tomorrow and explore the impact and convergence of business, technology, and people.
And this episode of Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization is sponsored by our partner, Y Institute, your personal and professional GPS for a meaningful life and a purpose-filled career. You'll hear more about the Y operating system and the Y Institute later. Today, we're honored and humbled to have Steven Kotler join us. Why so many people are listening or watching this episode can be summed up in two simple words: Steven Kotler. And for those who don't know who Steven is, you'll be thrilled that you decided to click play and tune in. So this is the perfect time to have Steven because it's the end of the year. And what does that mean? New Year's resolutions, and millions of people will be making them. They're going to start exercising on January 2nd. They're going to lose a few pounds during the month of January. They're going to find another job that they've been putting off for probably the last 6 months or a year or longer. And while these might be big steps for these individuals, they're really pretty modest in the scheme of life. So let's try this one on for size. When you're looking at New Year's resolutions, mine will be to speak clearly. I wonder how many people might include to do the impossible. You heard that right. On your New Year's resolution is 2023. I'm going to do the impossible to achieve what our guest Steven Kotler calls paradigm shifting. Nothing is the ever same goal. But before we bring Steven on, it's time for our Perfect Labor Storm segment. So on each episode, we focus on just one disruptive, surprising, or worrisome trend that we believe you should know. Here is today's Perfect Labor Storm. So get this. The Flow Research Institute reveals that top executives in Flow are 500% more productive. Juxtapose that with the numerous studies that are coming out almost every day these days that report nearly 6 in 10 employees are burned out, and 8 out of 10 suffer from work-related stress. So one solution offered to mitigate burnout and stress is more flexibility or more balance with personal and work life. But if I'm doing the math right, it seems the answer might lie in Steven's research, Flow. If executives in Flow are 500% more productive, that means they can produce the same amount of work on Monday as the rest of the people in steady state Flow produce working Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So I'm not sure if we got your attention yet, but how about this? Flow helps people amplify creativity 400 to 700%. The solution to burnout and stress and creativity might not be in the 4-day work week, remote work, office parties, other perks. It might be in human peak performance. So before we welcome Steven, just a reminder that you can earn SHRM credits for just listening to today's episode. Just go to the Googlizationnation.com website, click on podcasts, then SHRM credits, complete the short questionnaire so we know that you actually listened. And while you're there, if you're not a member of Googlization Nation, please sign up. It's free. And if you're listening to today's episode as a podcast, please rate the show and leave us a review.
Perfect. And now just a little bit about Steven, and then we're going to bring him on. Steven Kotler is a New York Times bestselling author, award-winning journalist, the executive director of the Flow Research Collective, and he's also one of the world's foremost experts on human performance. He's the author of 9 bestsellers out of 13 books total, including The Art of Impossible, The Future is Faster Than You Think, Stealing Fire, and The Rise of Superman, Bold and Abundance, to name a few. His work's been nominated for 2 Pulitzer Prizes. It's been translated into over 40 languages and over 100 publications, including the New York Times Magazine, Wired, The Atlantic, Time, the Harvard Business Review, just to name a few. And he's also the co-host of the Flow Research Collective Radio, a top 10 iTunes science podcast. Along with his wife and author, Joy Nicholson, he is the co-founder of the Rancho de Chihuahua, which is a hospice and special needs dog sanctuary. And one of the big reasons he's on today is he's got a brand new book that's coming out this February 2023, called NAR Country, Growing Old and Staying Rad. So we are so excited to be one of the first to preview it. And so without further ado, let's welcome today's special guest, Stephen Kotler.
Welcome there, Stephen.
All right, Jason, good to be with you.
Yeah, standing ovation from our Googleization Nation crowd.
Absolutely. So, Stephen, we got so much to dig into today, but why don't we start with this? Tell us a little bit about your journey of how you got into flow and peak performance and this being a passion of yours before we dive into the book.
So it's a great question. So I started my career as a journalist in the early 1990s, and I was fascinated by sort of 2 things. And at the time, they weren't overlapping at all. But journalism is this great gig where you get to, get paid to exploit your curiosity. And I was obsessed. I really wanted to understand how do people work, human behavior, how to and performance. But back then it was just human behavior. And it was a great time to be interested in it because neuroscience was starting to tackle these questions. I was always a little suspicious of psychology. It felt too squishy, too subjective, very individual. Things were really indeterminate. Neuroscience turns out to be just the same, but I didn't know that at the time. At the time, I was like, oh, neuroscience is absolute mechanism. It's same in everyone. It's shaped by evolution. So in the 90s, behavioral neuroscience, how do people work, was a thing. It was no longer like this cluster of neurons in this part of the brain does what. It was, hey, how do human emotions work? And how does consciousness work? And how do we make buying decisions? And, all those kinds of questions fascinated me. Simultaneously, totally unrelated, I was obsessed with action sports, surfing, skiing, rock climbing, snowboarding, and the like. And I was living in these communities, taking part in these adventures. And if you know anything about the 1990s and action sports, it's often referred to as the so-called era of impossible, where more impossible feats, things that had never been done before, got done. And what was really amazing, it wasn't just that we were doing the impossible, we were iterating on the impossible. Somebody would go out, they'd do something that nobody ever thought was possible. And then 2 days later, somebody else would do something slightly better or slightly different. And then 4 days later, it was on top. And so it was this crazy flowering of human potential, unlike anything that anybody had ever seen. And yet, in these communities, like with these actual athletes, what I was seeing up close did not match anything that was sort of in the peak performance literature. If you read especially going up to like the early 20th century, like peak performers, they have good childhoods. They get, they specialize early, they get coddled a lot, they get treated well, they study well, they come from, good families, they have money, they're well fed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all the folks I was hanging out with, this was a deep punk rock subculture. Everybody I knew came from like a broken home and a shitty childhood. They had no money. They had no education. There was so much risk taking and so much substance abuse. And normally, if you put those things together in a community, people die young and go to jail. What they do not do is reinvent what's possible for the human species. So what was happening with the athletes? How was this possible? Became my first question. And neuroscience was the tool I wanted personally to use to address it. And that was sort of where everything started for me. That led to countless articles. I wrote a blog for Psychology Today for a very long time on these ideas. I then turned around and wrote a blog for Forbes for a very long time. Psychology Today was sort of how does this stuff work? Forbes was how do we apply it for innovation and entrepreneurship and that sort of stuff. And that led into 7 books at this point, and actual, and then the Flow Research Collective, which is my current organization, is a science and training organization. On the research side, on the science side, we partner with folks at Stanford and UCLA and USC and on and on and on. And we study the neurobiology of peak human performance, what's going on in the brain and the body. We're performing at our best. And then we take that science and we use it to train people. And we work globally in about 130 countries. We work with everybody from members of the US Special Forces and professional athletes to a tremendous amount of C-suite executives and entire companies. We train folks at Facebook, Meta. We train folks at Bain Capital. We train folks at Accenture, San Francisco Police Department, the Air Force, big spectrum. And then we train individuals, soccer moms in Iowa, insurance brokers in Delhi, coders in, Bangkok, take your pick. So the only reason I think you would care about all that bragging is we're data geeks. We measure everything and anything. So we have a really good, wildly diverse, globally accurate picture of what works and what doesn't. But it started with a bunch of action adventure sport athletes doing stuff that nobody thought was possible, and they definitely shouldn't have been doing. And me trying to figure out what the hell was going on.
So, Stephen, you talk in your book, your new book's NAR Country, and it's talking about growing old, staying rad. Okay, so let's first decode what the book is. Let's talk about NAR, because a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with that. And gnarly, which is where it comes from, is sort of I wouldn't say it's the kindest word that people could call you. And then also staying rad. So kind of decode your title, your book, and then talk about, where that evolved from. But fascinating story about, the genesis was the pandemic.
Yeah, in a sense. So NAR Country is a book about growing old and staying rad. It's a book about peak performance aging. And before we get too deep into the weeds, let's just define a couple of terms so people know what we're talking about, because we're going to use them. One, I'm going to say the term peak performance over and over again. And what I mean by peak performance is nothing more or less than just getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. And when you're looking at peak performance, peak human performance, the heart of that biology is a state of consciousness known to researchers as flow. You may call it runner's high or being in the zone or being unconscious. The terms are endless. It is scientifically defined as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. More specifically, it refers to any of those moments of rapt attention and total absorption. It's so focused on what you're doing, on the task at hand, everything else just starts to fade away, melt away, and all aspects of performance, mental and physical, go through the roof. And at the start of the show, Ira, you mentioned a couple of things. It's actually not my research that you were talking about. It's the McKinsey Institute, right? The big business consultancy. They did a 10-year study of top executives in flow and discovered that they're on average 500% more productive. But that's just one example. Learning rates, creativity, cooperation, collaboration, empathy, perspective. The list is really quite long, because we're all optimized for flow. We're all optimized to perform at our best. We can all access this state. It's universal in humans, and it's everything. It's cognitive and physical. So that's definitions out of the way. The book is about peak performance aging. So what happened is, it's a really sort of long story. I tell this story at sort of at the end of the book, but it's actually the beginning of the book. I was on the phone, my last conversation with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the so-called godfather of flow psychology, and brilliant mind, great man, amazing. He passed away during the pandemic, but this is the last phone call we have together. Which was really, really sad, because we had just merged with his company. He had a 20-year leadership development company, and we just merged together. And we're going to do a whole bunch of work together. And he passed away before that could happen. But we were talking about, and I'd asked him a question about action sports, actually. It turns out he was a serious mountaineer and rock climber. And I wanted to know, he had never talked about it publicly. I was like, dude, you got to tell me, how much did your experience as an action sport athlete influence your early research? You climbed a lot of mountains, you did a lot of rock climbing. Tell me what's going on. You tell other stories at TED but just give me the truth kind of thing. And there's this long pause. He doesn't say anything. And I'm on the other end, it's 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. And I'm thinking to myself, oh crap, I just offended Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Oh shit. And finally he says, well, Stephen, you got to be careful. And I went, oh, what? Huh? I got to be careful. What are you talking? Like, what is this the answer to? And he'd had a stroke, and I was worried he had maybe like lost the plot. And right. And so I was like, well, Mike, Mihai, what do I have to be careful about? He's like, well, you do something your whole life for flow. And then you get to be my age and forget about climbing mountains. Some days I can barely get out of bed. You need a backup plan. You got to be careful. And it was literally like the godfather of flow psychology talking to like one flow junkie to another saying, look, man, however you get the most flow in your life, you sort of need a backup plan. Everything that we're about to talk about started out as there was 20 years of research into peak performance aging before that, but it was in all these different places. It wasn't really peak performance aging. It was all these. So I've been studying it, but I hadn't thought, oh, I got to put this all together. We'll come back to why this was my particular backup plan later. What I decided to do is teach myself how to park ski. Now, I was 53 years old at the time, and park skiing is the domain in skiing that involves doing tricks off jumps, on rails, and boxes. You saw the Olympic, it's Eileen Gu, only with gray hair. It's very, very dangerous. It's very, very acrobatic. And for about 12 different biological reasons that we can get into in a minute, it's considered impossible. Well, very, very difficult if you're over the age of like 30, 35. By 40 or 50, it gets to be downright impossible and outright crazy. And what I knew that other people didn't maybe was there were a bunch of studies in fields like systems neuroscience and embodied cognition and flow science and a couple other fields that in the lab, in these studies, these ideas said, hey, if you put them together, older adults should be able to learn and progress in seemingly impossible activities like park skiing. And I decided to put it to a test. And I made a list of 18 tricks it was actually 20 tricks that would get me from 0 to intermediate. Never done this before to I'm an intermediate. I created a methodology, plan, blueprint. Here's the tricks. And the goal was really, I wanted terrain parks come in sizes. There's kiddie parks, small parks, medium parks, large and extra large. And the extra large is pros and large is experts. I figured if I could ski a stylish line through a kiddie, small and medium park, right, and learn these 20 tricks, that was pretty. I got to intermediate and I had like, wow. And I thought maybe it'll take 5 years, right? But it was a backup plan. We'll talk about what that plan was in a bit, but cool. I got there in a season and it was crazy how fast I progressed. Like it didn't make any sense how fast I was progressing in this activity. My ski partner, now mind you, I had been skiing my whole life. I was a big mountain skier, which meant I like stayed in contact with the snow and went straight down the hill, right? Park skiing is backwards and sideways and upside down. There's all kinds of tricks. Very, very different. I had a ski partner. He was a former sponsored athlete. He'd gotten very hurt, stopped park skiing, hadn't park skied in probably a decade. He started applying my stuff, comes back to the sport, and he's making crazy progress. So we think to ourselves, wow, this is really cool. We've run the world's smallest pilot study, but we've got tantalizing data. So we then take all these ideas, we assemble a group of 17 older adults, ages 30 to 68, and we, in 4 days, and I can talk about what we did more specifically, we teach them how to park ski. And then we take these same ideas, take it out of park skiing and snowboarding, and just run 500 people through the protocol to see if they can start reinventing what's possible in the second half of their lives, which was what this was all about in the first place, right? And the results have been stunning. So we like what we've done. We're confident in it. There's way more research to be done, but in our country really sort of chronicles that original experiment. And it was two things. One is experiment in peak performance aging. The other thing, and I'm sure you noticed this as you were going through it, it's a bit, it goes day by day through my season. And the reason is nobody has ever, at least that I am aware of, written a book about applied peak performance. Even myself, and I've written 7 books about the science of peak performance and how it works in the real world and in business and in science and technology, all these places. But like, how do you apply this stuff on a day-to-day basis? You need to do something like this to show people what it looks like. So it's a book about applied peak performance and probably the most practical book I've ever written on that subject. coupled to, hey, this is peak performance aging. And the short version about peak performance aging, and then I'll shut up. But one thing I want to get out to sort of sum this up is, since the old idea about aging, which is the traditional idea, what I like to call the long, slow rot theory. It's the idea that our mental skills, our physical skills, they decline over time. There's nothing you can do to stop the slide. Good luck. And it turns out there's a pile of research dating from the 90s to now that says this is not true at all. All the skills we used to think declined over time, it turns out we now know they're use it or lose it skills. And if you never stop training these skills, as I discovered, and as everybody I worked with discovered, you can learn them and even advance them far later in life than anybody thought possible. And just to put a bow on this for people, if you go to narcountry.com, the website, GNAR country.com, I have to go back to the title in a second now that I've said all this stuff. You can click on Peak Performance Aging Experiment. We made a video. We actually had a National Geographic camera and follow us around and record the experiment so you can see all of this. Now, what is the title of the book? NAR, as you pointed out, is action sport slang. It's short for gnarly, and it's a very specific meaning. Action sport athletes are actually very, very literal because these terms can be life-saving in certain scenarios. In action sports, NAR is defined as high in perceived risk and high in actual risk. Hey guys, you sort of dropped off my screen. I can't tell if you're still with me.
We're still here. We're just highlighting you.
All right, cool. High in perceived risk, high in actual risk. And country is any defined territory or landscape. And thus, NAR country is a great description of our later years, high in perceived risk, high in actual risk. And as I sort of learned along the way, phenomenal description of the gritty mindset we need to thrive in those later years. So that's the book. That's where it came from. That's the title. And that's a little bit about it. How'd I do?
Great. Stephen, as you're describing all of that, I keep thinking you beat Ponce de Leon to finding the fountain of youth, which is awesome. And in thinking about that, you talked a little bit about how in the book you go into detail about kind of what that recipe is of how you get people to peak perform later on in the back half of their life. Can you share maybe not all of the trade secrets, but what were some of the things you found that are really important for people right now in their minds that are thinking, hey, I'm in my 40s, 50s, or 60s. I've always thought about doing fill in the blank, whatever it is, but I'm too old. Where did they start in terms of doing something?
Let me tell you one bit of good news, and then let me tell you the bad news about the good news as a way to answer your question. That's in terms of where we start, just because it's surprising. The answer here is surprising. So it turns out, and this was predominantly the foundation work of Gene Cohn, who is often talked about as the godfather of peak performance aging. He is the first director of the National Institute on Aging. He's run a number of the biggest studies ever on aging, and he discovered something shocking, revolutionary, and really important, which is rather than like a long, slow decline in our brain, as we enter our 50s, because of certain shifts in brain function and certain genetic things, et cetera, we gain access to legitimate cognitive superpowers. So one of the reasons I was able to learn so quickly is in our 50s, intelligence soars, and really like abstract reasoning, problem solving, really difficult to access portions of intelligence soar because of neurobiological changes. Same thing happens to creativity. Creativity soars, and including divergent thinking, right? Thinking outside the box, the hardest, most difficult to train aspect of creativity, and really at the heart of innovation, right? We want to keep pace in an accelerated society in our businesses. This kind of creativity and innovation, problem solving you really need. We also see, and HR is going to love this, expansions in empathy and wisdom. Both happen naturally in our 50s. And when I use the term wisdom, wisdom is an actual defined neurobiological trait. It's about 12 different structures of the brain working together. I'll talk a lot about expertise and wisdom. Expertise is all the stuff you learn consciously. Right? I'm reading a book about Ponce de Leon. I'm learning about the Fountain of Youth. Wisdom is all the stuff I'm learning unconsciously. So Jason and I are interacting for the very first time, and we're picking up subtle non-conscious signals. Oh, he's friendly. Oh, he doesn't like this topic. Oh, all that stuff. That's wisdom. And they're stored in different areas of the brain. Peak performance aging allows us to gain access to new levels of empathy and perspective taking and wisdom second half of our lives. Now, here's the bad news, and here's the answer to your question. So where do you want to start? Here's something really cool. Peak performance aging starts young, one. And I'm going to tell you something else that's really, really cool. Most of the giant big levers that people reach for when they think about peak performance aging, they're going to mess with their diet, maybe. They're going to, if they're Western traditionalists, they're going to go to the doctor and they're going to start taking a bunch of pills. If they're a little funkier, they're going to go to their functional med doc and start taking a bunch of supplements, right? And this is sort of and they're going to start getting more exercise. And it's probably going to be aerobic exercise. Chances are they're going to go run on a treadmill or like this is what most people do when they want to like get better. And it turns out not only does peak performance aging start young, but the biggest levers that are available to you are cognitive levers, psychological levers, and lifestyle changes. And peak performance aging starts in our 20s, because if you want access to the so-called superpowers of aging, you have to pass through what psychologists call moderators, if-then condition, gateways of development. By age 30, you have to have solved the crisis of identity. You got to know who you are in the world by around 30. The reason is, in the next decade, by around 40, you got to solve what economists sometimes term as match quality or match fit, which is a blend between who you are, your values, your strengths, and what you do in the world. Usually what you do for a living or what you do with the bulk of your time. That's in your, and if you don't know who you are by 30, you can't solve that by 40, because how do you know what your strengths are and your values are if you don't know who you are in the first place? In your 50s, you have to forgive yourself and all those who have done you harm, or it gets in the way of the empathy and the wisdom that is supposed to be unlocked. And finally, if you really want access to all those superpowers, you need to be creative in your 50s. Creativity and the act of thinking creatively actually is what really unlocks a lot of those superpowers. And if you want to hang on to those superpowers for the rest of your life and for them to really matter, two other things come into play afterwards. You have to train against physical fragility, right? There are a lot of things that will start to decline. That's automatic. The difference between then and now is we used to think we were just screwed. Now we know, oh no, if you train like a madman, you actually can hang on to this stuff so much longer. In fact, just like let me just give you one data point to emphasize this, because it's the one I like the most, because it was the one I'd heard so frequently, which is VO2 max, which is the upper threshold aerobic capacity, starts falling off in our 20s and like really goes off a cliff after 50. And people were like, yeah, you'll never get top VO performance in somebody over 50. You just can't do it. And it turns out that's totally wrong, with a couple of modifiers. But there's all this data that just came out on, they started measuring VO2 max of 80-year-old triathletes. And they found their VO2 max is like a healthy 35-year-old male. So in their 80s. And so, and you can start training it, by the way. If you're 79, you can start training it and make a dent. But what the research shows is to preserve the VO2 max, you really want to start in your 50s. So physical fragility, you got to start fighting against in your 50s. And we can talk more about what that means later. I will also say that knowing what this means, and I'll get to this, but I just want to make this point, really matters from an HR perspective. Knowing all these things, and what I'm about to say really matters from an HR perspective. I'll come back to the point in half a second and finish this one. You also have to train up risk tolerances. So simply put, all the things that we get, all the superpowers, if there's too much fear in our system, when we're fearful, we're not creative. The brain gets logical and linear. So when we're scared, it goes, give me a safe solution. Give me the thing that worked a million times. Don't find some wild new solution that may not work, because you know my ass is on the line. So risk aversion increases over time. There are certain categories where this is not true. Social risk actually doesn't, because by the time we're 50, we just don't care what other people think. So we'll go up and introduce ourselves to strangers, no problem. And if you work in markets and understand money, financial risk doesn't decline. If you don't, you're saving for retirement and you get more financially conservative. But if you know what you're doing, that increases. But all the other categories decrease. you have to fight risk aversion. You have to train up openness to experience and a bunch of other things to preserve all of these superpowers. Now, the final thing I want to go back to the HR point and why I think all this matters, especially on your show. I have spent years, decades at this point, talking to CEOs about flow, peak performance, their companies, their organizations, and we spend, I got to say, at least 50% of every conversation I've ever had has been on hiring and training, which seem to drive more CEOs crazy than almost anything I know. And as a CEO, I totally emphasize, or not as an executive director. I have a different CEO now, former CEO, now executive director. My point is that in talking to CEOs about business in the 21st century, I always hear two things. I hear, God, I want creative employees, innovative employees, because I want to keep pace with the rate of change and competition's kicking my butt. And how do we do that? And the other thing that I hear is I need empathetic employees, and I need empathetic employees from a psychological safety. I want to build great teams. They got to function well together. Teams are at the heart of great businesses. Without psychological safety, without empathy, you can't do it. And then the mantra of 21st century business over and over and over again is customer-centric thinking. And how can you think like your customers without empathy? My point is, well-trained over 50-year-olds are the ideal workforce of the 21st century. We are literally, HR departments are literally laying off right now in droves for really stupid ideas everybody they actually need to thrive in the 21st century. But it's not indiscriminate 50-year-olds that you want to be hiring. You need 50-year-olds who actually have solved the crisis of identity, match fit, forgiveness, have trained up creativity, have trained down physical fragility, and trained down risk aversion. And if you get that right, you're talking about an HR business revolution in terms of who we're hiring and who we need going forward in the 21st century. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys about it, because this is I make this point at the very end of the book, right? Almost the last, I think, 3 pages from the ending. But it was, in a sense, one of those things. This is also sort of like, I knew this before Chick sent me. I had this conversation. So it was one of the things I went, oh shit, this might be possible because of these superpowers of aging. Maybe this will actually work. And if it does work, what does it mean for HR? So those are all the big picture, but you asked a second question. And if I'm talking too much and you want to ask another question, tell me to shut up. If not, I'm going to make one more point. All right, one more point. You asked where to start. And where to start is actually very, very simple, because the data is overwhelming and it's surprising. Mindset is where you start. So there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that shows that those people who have a positive mindset towards aging, meaning they believe that the second half of their life is filled with potential and opportunity, and it could be exciting. Literally, health outcomes are much better. Longevity outcomes are incredible. There have been tons of studies, because this work dates back to Ellen Langer's lab at Harvard in the 70s and goes from there. But one of the most famous studies, the Ohio longitudinal study of aging and retirement. It's a 20-year study, 75 to 95, of the impact of mindset on aging and longevity. Much better health outcomes along the way, and an extra 7.5 years of life. And this number has been found again and again and again. So the place this has to start is you have to shift your mindset. And I can talk a little bit more if you want about where mindset comes from, but we'll stop there for now. And I've given you a boatload of information. But these are all some of the biggest levers along the way. And none of them are the things you think about when you think about successful aging and peak performance aging, right? Everything I just said, you're like, really? This is successful aging? But yeah, it's exactly how our neurobiology is designed to work.
It's Stephen, there's so much there that's absolutely fascinating. The one I'd like to ask a follow-up question on is, you mentioned that we have research that shows that fear kills creativity. Does it shock you at all? We're still living in a time where we're seeing many top-level executives that are getting front page of the media, it seems like every day, that are using fear tactics with people in terms of trying to increase productivity and efficiency.
Yeah, so fear is awesome motivator if you're a peak performer. The peak performers I know, the best of the best, love fear as a motivator, because fear is good because it gives you focus for free. Anything that gives you focus for free is amazing because it's the largest burden on the brain. Brain's an energy hog. It's 2% of our body weight, uses 25% of our energy at rest. What's the thing the brain burns most of the energy, its energy doing? Paying attention, focusing. Anything that gives you focus for free, be it intrinsic motivators, curiosity, passion, purpose, right? Focus for free on all those things, or fear, all very beneficial. The difference is peak performers have more experience playing with fear, right? You can train yourself up to get really good at it. And for peak performers, I will, when I'm starting to write a book, I'll always say, well, where's the largest challenge? What really scares me? I want to go in that direction. But I've written 14 books and 12 of them have been bestsellers. So I've got some confidence here that I know what I'm doing and I can rise to the challenge. So great. It's a super motivator for me. But if you're not good at dealing with fear, you've got massive problems. Fear, from a performance standpoint, is not just creativity. It crushes learning, crushes creativity, crushes motivation. In fact, back to an HR topic, I always, when we hire at the Flow Research Collective, everybody on my staff knows this. I always tell people, you are hiring two employees. You are hiring that person when things are going well, and you are hiring that person when they're scared. And if you work in a entrepreneurial business of any kind, something that moves fast, where shit goes wrong, you better, you got to pay attention to that. A little bit of norepinephrine, which is the chemicals underneath fear, are norepinephrine, which is a neurochemical, and cortisol, which is a hormone. First of all, they're horrible for your system in large amounts. A little bit is great. It primes learning, but there's a sweet spot. Too much completely blocks learning, destroys creativity. In fact, the part of our brain that makes decisions about, am I going to search for a logical answer or am I going to search for a creative answer, to the anterior cingulate cortex, and how active, how much norepinephrine is in that part of the brain is what determines what it does. So it goes on and on and on, but there's huge penalties for too much stress. Using fear as a motivator, using fear as a selling tactic, first of all, it's lame. Most of us know this is being done to us at this point, really well aware of it. And so most people, you've lost me entirely. Like, if I see you using fear as an anything, I'm out. I'm done. I don't want anything to do with you. It's an end of our relationship kind of thing. It's cheap marketing. It's cheap attention gathering. It doesn't work in the long haul because it burns people out. And you're not going to end up where you want to go ultimately. And you know this. You can threaten to fire an employee, or you can, work with them a different way, which is more, you get to threaten to fire an employee once, right? That's sort of a card you get to play once, maybe twice. But after that, you're done. You better find a different motivator. This is not going to work.
So, Stephen, we got to take a quick break, but it's amazing. This has just gone incredibly fast. But the one thing is, you may not know this about me. I've been described as a millennial in a baby boomer body. I can tell you from the physical fragility that you talked about, that sometimes tying my shoe or picking something up from the floor is an Olympic event to go through that as the baby boomer body. But as the mind, I just sold second business, starting a new one. People were talking about, when am I going to retire? When am I going to slow down? And Jason knows this, and most of the audience knows this, if anybody knows me. It's that my mind is still thinking as a 20 or 30-year-old. It's like, how
old are you? How old are you?
I'll be 72.
I bet this isn't the work I do, but I'm happy to make recommendations. Get you the right kind of physical training. You could reboot functional fitness really easily.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And I even as you described, I exercise every day. I do 45 or 50 minutes on a Stairmaster. I do, what I don't do is enough stretching, but I do activity every day.
Yeah, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, I heard you. I heard you loud and clear.
Right thing, but you do not want to be. So okay, So very quickly, I just have to say this because we mentioned the Stairmaster twice. One of the reasons action sports in our country action sports in general are so great as a peak performance aging tool. If you want to preserve brain function late in life, right? Stave off cognitive decline, stave off dementia, Alzheimer's, right? There are two things. What you really want is neurogenesis and the birth of new neurons, the birth of new neural nets. Where does most of the adult neurogenesis take place? In a part of the brain known as the hippocampus. It does long-term memory, but it also does a very specific thing. It does location, place, grid cells, space cells. This is what's in the hippocampus. Why? Because when we evolved, it really mattered. Remember where you were when something important happened. So if you want to stimulate neurogenesis, you want to have emotionally charged experiences in novel outdoor environments, because that's exactly what the brain evolved to do. So if you take your running off your treadmill and into the outdoors, novel environments, bury your roots every day kind of thing, but massively amplifies neurogenesis and preserves those neural nets. So like you're almost there, but you got to take it outside.
We'll take it outside we'll have to talk to you about how do you keep the hips going. So, and the knees, the hips and the knees. So, but we are going to take a short break. We are talking with, as we've described it before, incomparable Steven Kotler. Amazing. I was the fastest 35 minutes I think that we've ever had on this show, and we say that every week. But appreciate you being here. Appreciate everybody listening. We've got a pretty active chat board. If anyone has any questions, please post them. We'll try to get them to Steven. If not here, we'll try to get a response afterwards. But we're going to take a really short break and talk about adaptability and purpose. Stay tuned.
For most of us, change is freaking terrifying. And unfortunately, there's no app to adapt. That might change in the not so distant future. But for now, we're on our own. That means we can either accept our default future or reimagine our tomorrow. For those of you who choose default, good luck. Just remember, there's no pause button for change. You can't turn back the clock. And there's no get out of jail free card in this age of perpetual uncertainty. Like it or not, change will happen all around us. And that change is not becoming just more disruptive and frequent, but volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, or VUCA. Fortunately, you can make change work for you and turn it into your personal and competitive advantage. Reimagine your future to one in which you're living with purpose, you're happy, and you're growing, thriving, and flourishing. If you're ready to rewrite your next life chapter and regain control of your destiny in this never normal world, your journey starts here. Contact the leader in adaptability and making change work for you, your team, and your organization. Ira S. Wolfe, adaptability.expert.
There's a certain kind of coach who believes what we believe, who leads people to greatness, who gets people unstuck, who unlocks all of your passion. A coach who helps people discover what drives them, to tap into their superpowers. That knowing your why is the first step to untap potential, to focus, to breakthroughs. A coach who's looking for a better way. Are you that coach?
Hey, welcome back, everyone, to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization Show. We're with Steven Kotler today. We're talking about flow in our country and aging and peak performance. If you missed the first part of the show, you got to go back and click rewind and listen from the beginning or pick it up on the podcast. Steven, there were so many things. You talked about relating this to HR. You talked about older workers, and companies have been shedding older workers for years. And just at the time when they've got wisdom, You talked about empathy, certainly much more than a buzzword anymore. Talking about human connection. I was listening to a show last night or a podcast, and the new research is that one out of every 4 males in the work, I don't know if it was in the workplace or just in general, are lonely. They don't have a single friend. And again, how do you have this human connection? We talk about labor shortages. We talk about, every executive is talking about more productivity, more creativity, more innovation. How do they grow? But I love when you talked about hiring, that you hire 2 people. I've said for years, and that was sort of what my company was about, Success Performance Solutions, for 28 years, the one I just sold. But we talked about hiring people, and we did a lot of behavioral testing, cognitive testing, personality testing, that type of thing. But people would say, are they a good fit? And I'd always look for what you talked about, was that second person. What happens when when the second person shows up? And the analogy that I used was that everybody's looking to say, hey, it's got 3 round tires, but the fourth when is the fourth one going to go flat? How fast is it going to go flat? Doesn't matter that there's 3 good tires, but there's a 4th tire, and you have to address that issue. So I love everything you say and crossing over that. Now, the one thing, though, I know we probably have a lot of listeners. By the way, I'm disappointed you don't have your T-shirt on. Life is too short to go uphill. So I did read the book, see? But you talk about, there was a question you asked. How do you progress as a skier if you can't actually ski? And I think there's a lot of people here talking about that, is not only getting past the mindset of I'm too old to do that, or I don't live in the right place, or I've got too many, there's a whole list of excuses people have. How does I want to say extreme sports, but how does this, I guess, defiance of fear and defiance of aging fit for the average Jane, Joe, Bill, Sue, that's sitting out there in their office and say, I'm just trying to get my bills paid. I'm just trying to make enough so I have time. My kids, there's food on the table. My kids are taken care of. Because there's a lot of people that are literally just surviving and even finding a half hour to go outside and do something or exercise is pushing the limit. So how do you progress as a skier if you can't actually ski?
So I'm not actually going to answer that question. I'm going to answer the other question you asked, which is what should most people do to buy back time, right? When they're like, that's all they can do is just like, we can start. I just want to start there, because we haven't talked much about flow, and this is the answer is going to be very, again, kind of surprising here. So, flow significantly amplifies productivity, learning, motivation, creativity, et cetera, as you pointed out, and McKinsey discovered. Half day, 1 day in flow, you can get as much done as your steady state peers. 2 days a week in flow, you're 1,000% more productive in the competition, which is cool. My point is that flow, if you can get into more flow more frequently, you get much more done in much less time, and it's going to be much higher quality work. So the question is, and especially if you're super stressed out, right? You're describing people who are very stressed out, languishing a little bit, burned out, right? So overwhelming pile of research, a bunch of it came out of COVID, actually. They wanted to know who's flourishing now and who's getting their ass kicked, and what are the conditions, right? What are the variables that who's led to thriving now? And Adam Grant actually talked about this research in a recent TED Talk that he gave. But the one determinant of who's thriving now is who had the most flow during COVID. How much time you spent in flow was the single largest determinant. How much time you spend in flow is also very important towards preventing burnout. So these are related. And what we tell people, or we always start with people, is what's known as your primary flow activity. This is the thing you've done since you were a little kid that just drops you into flow. Most of the time you do the activity, you're going to just sort of disappear into the activity. For me, it's skiing. My wife, it's hiking the dogs into the backcountry. For friends of mine, it's gardening or dancing salsa or samba or, and by the way, I have to learn a bunch of very complicated calculus for some neuroscience work I'm doing. And I decided I went all the way back to Algebra 1 because I was getting confused. I was like, damn it, I'm just going to start over. And it turns out, second time around, algebra is flowy. Who knew? Turns out algebra can be flowy the second time through when you actually understand what the hell's going on, which is what happens when you learn at 55 what you should have learned in 5th grade. Besides the point. Anyways, that's your primary flow activity, right? And the thing I want to tell people is if you want more flow in your life, double down on your primary flow activity. Why? Flow is essentially kind of focusing skill. In the same way that mindfulness is like a focusing skill, flow is a kind of focusing skill. And the more flow you get, the more flow you get. So if I want a lot of flow at Tuesday at work, if I go skiing on Sunday, I'm training my mind to focus in a specific way. Bonus, when we drop into flow, the heightened productivity, the heightened motivation and the heightened creativity outlast the flow state by a day, maybe 2. Creativity, that's just Teresa Mabiel's work at Harvard. She's the one who figured out that creativity outlasts the flow state by a couple of days. And finally, and maybe most importantly, for peak performance aging and for just general peak performance, and we talked about it earlier, so I want to come back to it. When we move into flow, one of the things that happens neurobiologically is we get a global release of nitrous oxide. It's a gas signaling molecule. It's everywhere in the body. If you've ever worked out at the gym, right, about 20 minutes in, it gets quiet upstairs and your lungs open up, that's nitrous oxide. What that's doing is pushing stress hormones out of your system. Flow resets the nervous system to 0. So it calms you down. So this is huge, especially today, especially if we're burned out. So if you only have a half an hour to get outside, double down on your primary flow activity. What the research shows, if we could spend about 3 to 4 hours a week on our primary flow activity, that is enough to really start this moving. So again, it's a counterintuitive place to start, but you want to increase productivity. You don't have enough time. The very best way to increase productivity is to increase your time and peak performance. Flow is a very trainable skill, but if you're burned out, because that was who you were describing, this is where you want to start, right? So, how do you progress as a skier if you can't actually ski? I trained like a madman in the gym, and then we built a terrain park in an abandoned gold mine, and I dirt skied. And if you want to actually understand the meaning of pain, try to learn how to slide a rail on skis while you're falling into dirt. Even in full body armor, it was extremely painful.
So let me ask you talked a lot about the physical side of this. Is to get into flow and to stay in peak performance. How much has to be physical? I mean, none.
Well,
because you talked about your state.
Yeah,
I can't remember if it was before or after.
Mostly flow, and most of the work I do is on cognitive peak performance. But there are people who we work with athletes, and this is a book about an athletic study, but we train executives, right? Flow state, if you want more flow in your life, flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. Flow follows focus. That's what all the triggers they do. They drive attention in the present moment. They do it a bunch of different ways neurobiologically, but that's what is going on. There are 26 known flow triggers, and all of them grab hold of your attention and drive it into the current moment. So action sports work because risk is a flow trigger for sure, but it's not just physical risk, emotional risk, psychological risk, intellectual risk. These are all flow triggers. Creativity is a flow trigger. So pattern recognition, when we link ideas together, you get a little squirt of dopamine, which drives focus, right? That's a flow trigger. So I mentioned earlier, Chick sent me a high in my backup plan. This is a great time to mention this. I was a big mountain skier. Risk was my primary flow trigger. Risk as you get older as your primary flow trigger is stupid. That's dumb. That's not a good, healthy way, right, to age. what I figured is if I could go 0 to intermediate in park skiing and that sort of those tricks would allow me to creatively interpret the mountain terrain features. When you see an interesting feature, oh, look, there's a mountain of snow. I'll bet I could use it to spin, flip, whatever. That's pattern recognition. And if you stack creative idea on top of creative idea on top of creative idea, you actually get this amount of dopamine you get with risk. Novelty is another flow trigger. So this could mean go skiing in a new environment you've never been in. This could be try a new trick, or I have to, if you're looking at the bookshelf over my back, that's all neuroscience. And I have to read a lot of neuroscience to do my job. And most of what I read is textbooks. And as you can imagine, they're the most thrilling, exciting books you've ever read in your entire life, like page turners, right? So what do? When I have to read a bunch of neuroscience books, I tend to get a hotel room with a balcony that looks onto a huge natural vista. And I sit out there and I read. The novelty of the vista primes my system with some dopamine. And as I'm reading, I start making connections between ideas. That gives me a little more dopamine. Suddenly I'm reading in a flow state. Learning is through the roof. Retention goes up. I'm reading faster, et cetera, et cetera. So you can do it on the mountain, or you can do it, if you're just trying to train yourself up in whatever it is that you want to train yourself up in.
So, Stephen, for folks who may be listening who are thinking, well, I'm not sure what my flow activity is to get me in flow, how can they go about discovering that? And then a second question we have from a listener is, how would you change office environments to help teams flow in the workplace?
Okay, so both are great questions. Let me start with the second one because I forgot the first one already. But let's talk about the office environments, and then you can ask me the first one again. So there are individual flow triggers and group flow triggers. There's a shared collective version of a flow state. In fact, the most common flow state on earth is 2 middle managers in conversation at work. Why? Because management, once you're at the management level, there's a little risk involved, right? There's usually money on the line when you're talking about managers. So there's some risk, and interpersonal flow managers, they know how to manage. They know what to focus on, and they get right into it. And 2 managers who get into a conversation and lose a couple hours solving problems, most common flow state you can imagine. So very common at work. But if you want to optimize for team flow or interpersonal flow, open office plans are a disaster, just flat out disaster. They shouldn't exist. You need to be able to wall the individual off from the rest of the group. You need to be able to wall the team off. If you're looking for a model, what you're looking for is Skunkworks, innovation accelerators. The most famous innovation accelerator in business is Skunkworks, right? When Steve Jobs wants to invent the Macintosh, right? He leaves Apple, goes and rents a little shop behind the Whole Earth restaurant in Silicon Valley in Menlo Park, flies a pirate flag, right? Says it's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy, and secludes the research team. And what do you do in a Skunkworks, right? You wall everybody off. You have complete concentration. No idea too wild, too weird. So everybody's encouraged to take huge risks. And feedback is another flow trigger. You have very fast development cycles. The Skunkworks process is essentially an agile computing process, right? Fast feedback loops, rapid experimentation, run lots of little experiments. These are all flow triggers. They're all driving attention into the now. But walling the team off from the rest of the company is really key, walling yourself off. So when I work with organizations, I'm going to swear on your podcast, the first thing I say is, if you can't hang a sign at the door that says "fuck off, I'm flowing," you can't do this work. Forget about it. It's done. What does this mean in this new kind of multi-tier? I'm working at home, I'm working in the office, this kind of environment. 2 things. One, practice distraction management. If you're working alone, or even if you're working in an office environment, like email, cell phones, smartphones, messages, all of it, turn it off. Complete concentration is needed for flow. It's a flow trigger, right? That's why open office plans suck. In fact, really great work done on coders that shows that coders in flow, and coders need flow to do their job. If they get knocked out by a distraction, a knock at the door, it can take 15 minutes to get back into flow if they can at all. So there's a big cost to the distractions. If you're working at home, this also doesn't just mean shut off your cell phone and all that stuff. It means have your conversations. Talk to your wife, talk to your kids, talk to your boss, talk to your coworkers. Hey, if you leave me alone now, and research shows that 90-minute blocks actually work best for uninterrupted concentration. We can come back to why in a second. But if you leave me alone for 90 minutes, I'm going to get more done productivity-wise because I'll be in flow. You can have more of me later. You get more of me, I'm going to get time back, but you have to respect that. So first and foremost, open off plans are a disaster, and you have to understand how flow works, and complete concentration is at the heart of it. I will say on the team thing, there is something you actually need before that, which is when they study team flow, you need everybody bought in on the same goal. And it's got to be a goal that all the members of the team want to achieve, but nobody can achieve alone. So it's only by working together can you achieve. It's called a collective ambition so it's, if you're trying to engender team flow at work, the place you have to start is collective ambition. The team has to all be bought in that this thing that everybody wants, you can only get by working together. And so that it has to start there. You also have to wall the team off and do a whole bunch of other stuff. But I wanted to answer that question first, because I'm passionate about it, as you can see.
Absolutely. Well, what I heard from that, Stephen, is I'm going to tell my wife and kids, hey, Stephen said today, y'all need to leave me alone so I can get my stuff done during the day. Just kidding, honey. I know she's watching. But the other question, Stephen, wanted to ask you was, there's probably several people listening who this may be the first time they're hearing about flow, and they're wondering, I'm not sure I know what my flow state is or what my flow activity is. How do they discover that?
So I'm going to give you a very short answer. There's a lot of longer answers, but flow significantly increases learning and memory. And let me take this one step further. Quick shorthand for how do learning and memory work. The more neurochemicals that show up during the experience, the better chance that experience will move from short-term holding into long-term storage. Flow is this big neurochemical dump. One of the things neurochemicals do is they tag experiences important, save for later. So flow is this big neurochemical dump, a lot of neurochemistry, a lot of learning and memory. As a result, if I ask you to think back about your positive memories, go like 5 years at a time and think about your most positive memories. Some of them are going to be anchored to, dates. This was my birthday, or this was our anniversary, or this was my first date, my wife, those kinds of things. Once you get beyond those, chances are they're all flow states. And what you got to start asking yourself is, what do they have in common, right? When I was a little kid and getting into flow, were you alone or were you with other people? Are you wired for individual flow or are you wired for group flow? Ask yourself, was this a hand-eye coordination thing? Was it an intellectual test? Just interrogate your own experience, and that's how you center in on it. That's usually the easiest way. We could go into a lot more detail or whatever, but that's usually the simplest place to start.
I have one additional question, Stephen. Then you've been very generous with your time and this whole conversation. But you were talking about when we were talking about the change of the environment of having the skunk works, of having taking your teams and putting them in a non-distracted area or room or building or separate or however you do that. How does that fit into the whole conversation now about remote work? Where does flow fit into the remote work environment? Is it even possible to have?
Yeah, it's totally possible. So there's all kinds of studies. So if you're going to dive into the literature, you're going to hear the term presence. So if you're going into literature and you're looking for like flow on Zoom or flow on the internet and in media, in those studies, they use the term presence. It means roughly the same thing. But so you can have very flowy remote work conversations, but so group flow states, team flow states, they all have triggers. Some of this work, one of them is close listening. Close listening means I'm paying attention to you. I'm not thinking about the cool thing I'm going to say next, or, hey, did he just insult me? Is that a secret dip? Right? I'm not dwelling in the past. I'm listening to you. And this is so much more important. Zoom wise, right? Because close listening means I'm probably looking at the camera a little bit and not just you. So I'm making eye contact, right? You're doing all that stuff. If you can get it right, you can get flowy on Zoom call, but there's less margin for error, I think, because of how it works. But I also think a lot of the other distractions that you normally get in an office environment go away. I'm not a fan of office environments. I think they hinder a lot of productivity as a general rule. My company, I've got about 100 people who work for me. We've never had an office. We're all over the globe. We don't have an office. I don't want an office. We get together when we need to get together, but I'm a big believer that very little gets done with more than 3 people in a meeting. And so I try to have very few people in meetings, and I try to keep everything like very brief and focused in that way. But you definitely can, it's harder, but you can do it. The upside is that you have so much more control over your time working from home and how you choose to work. It's much easier to achieve peak performance. There are certain things that, obviously are difficult. And if you are an extrovert, it's going to be more problematic, right? If you're an introvert, it's a dream. If you're an extrovert, what I'm saying is going to be a little more problematic, and you definitely need that social bonding neurochemistry. So if you can't get it at work, you got to get it elsewhere, right?
So for every manager and leader and executive out there who said, we're going to have more flow, so everybody has to come back into the office, that's not what you're saying.
I don't think, there are certain companies that are really, really flowy and can do that work. But I don't think it's a deal breaker. Now I do think there are, and I think more research needs to be done. Sales teams do really well when they meet, right? There are certain kinds of teams that it's something about the cultural fit, and we need to really talk about it. This is sort of like we're at the cutting edge of like what we know and don't know. You know what I mean? Like I could keep going this way, but I'd be making shit up as I went along.
Well,
right?
It's ironic that you brought up sales, because sales was probably, it's a remote will never work, but sales has always been remote. People
Sales
are always out.
Sales itself is remote. What I have discovered is that sales people tend to be so gregarious, such extroverted people, and sales is so high pressure, high risk that their need for companionship, because it gives them safety and security at a way that they can't seem to get elsewhere. So that's about it. It's a slightly different thing, and it's not about what people think it is. And let me put it in a slightly different context for you. So one of the reasons social support is really important for peak performance, aging, and performance in general is, and this is key for sales, is every time you encounter a situation, your brain has to decide, is it a threat or is it a challenge, right? Either or. And one of the things it does to assess this is it says, do you got backup? Are there people who love you? Are there people who got your back, right? And if the answer is no, oh shit, this is a threat. And then you'll meet that threat with a tremendous amount of energy. So this actually ends up draining a lot of energy, and it's a real drain on performance. If you've got people who love you and are going to pick you up if you fall down, or people who understand the challenge and they've got your back, blah, 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 that calms you down. And because you're calming down, you're getting access to better learning, better creativity, all the stuff we talked about before. And so my suspicion is with salespeople, their jobs are so stressful and so scary that as a general rule, they need to be around each other, because it does that. It calms them down a little bit. So like, that's what, again, not like, that's not the reason most business people would tell you sales teams need to get together, right? That's not what you would actually hear. That's not standard business advice. But it's one of the reasons I like neurobiology so much. It's mechanism. It's how we work, and you're sort of getting under that squishy individual stuff.
We need to start wrapping up Stephen. We want to make sure we get the lightning round, but there's always one question we close with. It's, what should we have asked you, but that we didn't?
I wish you'd asked me the relationship between flow and your favorite word, adaptability.
Well, there we go. What's the relationship between flow and adaptability?
All right, I'm so glad you asked. So this is also essentially why one of the other reasons I'm in the world of peak performance aging. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the godfather of flow psychology, wrote a bunch of books on flow, wrote a couple of books on creativity, wrote a ton of books on adult development. Why? Flow actually sits at the heart of, it's the major engine of adult development. What does that mean? I said earlier, and then we're going to get back to adaptability, which was the core of the question that you asked me. We said flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. The most famous is known as the challenge skills balance. We pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of the task slightly exceeds our skill set. So you want to stretch, but not snap. What this means is every time we go into flow, we're pushing on our skills. We're learning, we're growing. When the back end of a flow state, we are more complex, we are more adaptable. This is actually how we grow as humans. This is the engine of adult development. This is how we grow up. And it is also how we become more complex, more adaptable, more wise. So a lot of this stuff you guys are aiming at, flow sits at the heart of, because this is biologically how we do it. To put it slightly, last statement, from an evolutionary perspective, one of the theories about flow and what it does is it's a signal of mastery. When we get into a flow state when doing an activity, it's a signal that we've actually mastered that activity. Which if you're a hunter-gatherer trying to figure out, like, did I learn how to fight with a spear before I go on my first tiger hunt? It's a good thing to know. Like, you want to know, right? Like, you want to be really sure. So anyways, that's the question I wish you asked me, and I hope the answer was good.
Absolutely, Stephen. And we can't believe it. We're coming up to the end of the show. You've been so gracious. And I can't help but think, Stephen, that this whole time you've shown us what being in flow is, because the amount that you covered today and enlightening all of us on peak performance has been simply fantastic. And so we're now going to segue into the final segment of the show, which we call our lightning round. We're just going to ask you about 3 questions to get to know you a little bit better on a personal level. So let's start with this one. What is your favorite song or band?
Song is probably going to go to Tom Waits. It'll be Cold, Cold Ground. And my favorite band is again, it's a difficult one, but it's probably Rise Against. Old punk band.
Nice. Do either of those get you in flow state? Are they a trigger for you?
It depends what it Rise Against. If I'm lifting, for sure. Really good. And really good. Punk is really good for downhill mountain biking and lifting. It doesn't tend to work. So I need hip hop for skiing. And Tom Waits probably does not put me into flow. But sometimes it makes me want to slit my wrists, but in a good way.
I like that. So it's almost like a metaphor here of like pairing fine wine with food is like the different types of music for different types of activity that you want to do. I love it. How about this one? If you could meet anyone in the history of the world, who would you want to meet and spend the day with?
William James, godfather of psychology. William James.
I love that. I actually have a plaque of William James. It's in my basement now, but it used to be in my old office whenever I used to work in an office space. Big so fan of William James. Yep, absolutely. I think the quote was, the greatest discovery of any generation is that man has the power over his life by the choices that he makes. Something to that effect. But huge William James fan too.
The discovery of any generation is that William James was there first. Like, it doesn't really matter, right? Wherever you go, like, if you can go all the way down and who do you bump into? God damn it. I thought I had an original thought. No, William James beat you.
That's right. I love it. And then how about this? We got to ask you, with being an expert on human capability, if you could pick a superpower or develop one, what would it be?
Teleportation.
That's definitely the most popular one that we get, isn't it, Ira?
Yeah, it absolutely is. It's like keeps coming up almost every week.
Seriously?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Damn. Oh well. I was thought I was being original.
No original idea there, Stephen. I'll go back to William James.
Please ask me again.
What was that? If you could pick any superpower, what would you pick?
Originality.
Love it. Perfect. Absolutely love it. Well, the name of the book is In Our Country, everybody. And it's coming out in February. Is that right, Stephen, when it's actually going to go out on bookshelves and be able to buy it on Amazon?
Yeah, if you're dropping this first, so I want to, if this is early, folks, go to neurocountry.com. We've got, I'm giving, pre-sales help me hit bestseller lists. And as a thank you, we're giving away $1,750 worth of peak performance training bonuses for anybody who pre-orders. So they're cool. Like that. I worked really hard. We made amazing stuff for folks this time.
Love it. And again, that's narcountry.com, GNAR country.com, to be able to pre-order the book and get in some of those contests to be able to earn some of the peak flow training that comes along with it. Stephen, any other places where folks can get in touch with you and learn more about your work that you'd like to share?
StephenKotler.com is me. FlowResearchCollective.com is the flow company. And one thing that for everybody listening, if you want more flow in your life, so it turns out there are 6 major flow blockers, things that stand between people and more flow. And I got so tired of explaining them that we built a diagnostic, and anybody can take it. If you go to www.flowblocker.com, it's a free diagnostic. We'll email you the results, and even better, we'll email you a detailed multi-page, step-by-step, here's your action plan. So there's a whole bunch of stuff for our listeners.
Perfect. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope to have you on again in the future to talk about this and the continuation of your work. I'm going to kick it back over to Ira as he gets ready to segue us to the end, but it's been a pleasure being with you today.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. It was great to meet. Thanks for being so generous with your time. You literally, this was a rabbit hole. So for every response that you gave, I had like 3 more questions. So hopefully that you might come back some other time.
More than happy to.
Or I'll be sending these to you. And there was a number of questions from some of our listeners as well. So I'm going to ship those over to you. Hopefully we can get some responses for them too. But I know you don't celebrate the holidays, but have a happy New Year and happy skiing. Hopefully you got some good powder out there.
Thank you, gentlemen. It was a pleasure hanging out with you. I appreciate your interest in my work.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen.
Appreciate it. Well, that was an amazing show. Oh, what a way to close the year out.
Ira, I took copious notes, and I mean, for me, there were so many, but I know we're up against time. But the one here near the end, when Stephen said, we want to help people stretch but not snap. I mean, if you could put in a nutshell what we are experiencing in the workplaces of where people are being stretched way too far beyond their capacity, and that's why they're burned out. It's why we're seeing so many waves of mental health concerns coming on the back end of the pandemic, people struggling to get into flow and figure out the integration between work and life. I mean, I think that puts it beautifully, is that we're stretching people to the point of snapping. And so there's a lot of really good information there that he also shared in terms of what this means for managers, in terms of how they lead and how you provide feedback and how you support your people. So that was one of the big takeaways for me. How about you?
Well, again, so many. I stopped taking notes. I was just writing down the timestamp. So he'd say something, I just write down the time and we'll go back and listen to it and pull it out. So we'll certainly have our share of audiograms and videograms and quotes from this. I think it was the relationship that I didn't put together. And I'm so glad we asked the question, what didn't we ask? And he asked and he answered, is the connection between flow and adaptability. But there was also many comments, many statements he made, the connection between flow and purpose, flow and goals. But for anyone, again, we've had a preview of the book, and unfortunately, most of you won't be able to get it for a couple weeks or maybe 2 months. I'm not sure when in February it's coming out. But again, we're all aging. We hear this all the time: too old to do this, too old to do that. And even today, he had so many quotes as you shared. But from the book, I wrote down a couple things. Fighting the urge to die a little bit each day. He said that a little differently in the beginning, but that was something we're always up against. How to not go gently into old age. He talks about teaching an old dog new tricks. I mean, these were just things, that, again, we hear every day. They hold us back. We make life decisions about them, which all have negative consequences. But I also liked how he responded to becoming, I guess, aging, as well as at the same time, not only were we aging, but that we have to be sensitive to that. It's not just being reckless. It's just not saying it's 50 or 60 or 70. You go out like he's doing and skiing. But it was so powerful that he included that most of the blockers are mental. That is a cognitive sense, that having stretching yourself, pushing your step, stretching but not breaking, relates to our relationships, our emotional limits. So again, there was so much, and I'm just sort of rambling here, but hopefully people will re-listen to this and, definitely buy the book and go to the website. There's a lot on his website. There's a lot of clips where you can just, frankly, Google Stephen Kotler. He's all over.
Absolutely. And we'll look forward to pushing out some information also. We'll be doing newsletter, blog post, and things from this episode of Key Takeaways for everybody, and be on the lookout for the podcast here in the next few days. But until next time, I'm Jason Cochran. We want to thank you, our listeners, for showing up today and listening. If you haven't subscribed to Geeks Geezers Googlization on your favorite podcast platform, please do so. Great way to end the year and start the new year is to make sure that our latest episodes you're getting notifications for those, and they're going right to your feed to be able to listen to those. And please leave us a review. We are in the top 1% in the world. We are the most forward-thinking podcast from the People Forward Network. A lot of accolades that have come this year, and that's all because of you, our listeners, and because of our amazing guests. So thank you for tuning in and engaging with us. And as we sign off for 2023, here's to another amazing year ahead of us with many more wonderful guests like Stephen Kotler.
And I'm Wolfe. Special thanks to Stephen for being so generous with his time. He's quite a busy guy. In between his writing and skiing, we're so happy that he was able to join us and spend an extended period of time with us. Special thanks to the Y Institute for partnering with us and sponsoring this episode. Thank you for being part of Googlization, everyone. And thank you, Jason. This has been a great year. It's about a year and a half. It's almost about a year and a half that we've been doing this. We probably have close to 100 episodes under our belt at this point, and appreciate all the success, and really looking forward to 2023 with you.
Likewise, partner.
Until next time, don't let the shift hit your plans.